Chapter 7 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 7. 1798 to 1799. Egypt. On his return from Italy, Napoleon appeared at the height of his glory, and yet he was not contented. In vain the crowd showed for him a sort of idolatry. Nothing could satisfy his boundless ambition. No sovereign had ever produced in the capital the impression of the victor of Rivoli. His little hotel in the Rue Chantraine, the name of which was soon to be changed to the Rue de la Victoire, had more prestige than the palace of kings. Every time he went to the theatre, he had to conceal himself in the back of his loge, to avoid the enthusiastic acclaims of the spectators. Josephine participated in the glory of her husband, and nothing troubled her happiness. Her son Eugène had returned from Italy, and her daughter Hortense was near her at the school of Madame Campan, at St. Germain. She had never been so happy. The Bonapartes had not succeeded in creating dissension between her and her husband. She was rejoiced to see that her little hotel had become the rendezvous of the best Parisian society. But neither the affection of Josephine, nor the flattery of the admirers by whom he was surrounded, nor success of every kind could distract the thoughts of being incapable of repose. As Talleyrand once said of Napoleon, "Celui qui donnerait un peu de paresse à cet homme serait le bienfaiteur de l'univers." Desirous of action, he looked forward with anxiety to the hour that would see the public curiosity appeased. When Bourrienne remarked to him that it must be very gratifying to have the acclaims of his fellow citizens, he replied, "The people would crowd around me just as eagerly if I were going to the scaffold." The 10th of December a fête was given by the directors at the Luxembourg in honor of Bonaparte. On this occasion he was to present formally the Treaty of Campo Formio. An address of fulsome flattery was pronounced by Talleyrand, to which Bonaparte briefly responded. Then Barras spoke; the climax of his oration being reached when, pointing northwards, he exclaimed, "Go there and capture the giant corsair that infests the seas. Go punish in London outrages that have too long been left unavenged." Whereupon, as if overcome by his emotion, he embraced the general. "Here," says Rose, "the curtain falls on the first or Italian act of the young hero's career, soon to rise on Oriental adventures which were to recall the exploits of Alexander." Early in 1798 Bonaparte was appointed by the Directory to the chief command of the army of England, and on the 10th of February he left on a short tour of inspection of the northern ports. He returned to Paris by way of Antwerp and Brussels. He was convinced that any attempts against England in this direction would be barren of results. In a report to the Government on the 23rd February, he thus sums up the whole situation: "Whatever efforts we make, we shall not for some years gain the naval supremacy. To invade England without that supremacy is the most daring and difficult task ever undertaken. We must really give up the expedition, and concentrate all our attention and resources on the Rhine, in order to deprive England of Hanover and Hamburg, or else undertake an eastern expedition which would menace her trade with the Indies." Bonaparte had little difficulty in obtaining the consent of the Directory to his Oriental plans, as they were pleased at the thought of his departure from France. Although the object of his expedition was unknown, yet every one wished to accompany him. Not only military men desired to take part, but also civilians, savants, engineers, and artists. Bourrienne, who was in the secret, asked Bonaparte how long he expected to remain in Egypt, to which he replied, "A few months or 6 years. All depends on circumstances." On the 3rd of May, 1798, Napoleon and Josephine, after having dined at the Luxembourg with Barras, en petit comité, went to the Théâtre Français to hear Talma in Macbeth. The hero of Italy was saluted with the same acclaim as during the first days of his return. At the end of the performance he returned home, and at midnight set out for Toulon, accompanied by Josephine, Eugène, Bourrienne, Duroc, and Lavalette. Paris was ignorant of his departure, and the next morning, when every one thought he was still in the Rue de la Victoire, he was already far on his way to the coast. He had not even allowed Josephine to go to St. Germain to embrace her daughter before her departure. She did not know the destination of the expedition, or whether she would be allowed to accompany it. The party arrived at Toulon on the 9th of May. Bonaparte wished to sail at once, but he was detained in port for 10 days by contrary winds. In anticipation of an invasion of England, nearly all the ships of the British navy were blockading the northern ports of France, and guarding the English coast. There was not a warship left in the Mediterranean until Nelson arrived off Toulon 2 days before the sailing of the French fleet. He was then driven out to sea by a violent wind, and was not able to take up his station again until the 1st of June, when the French fleet was already 12 days on its way. The objects of the Egyptian expedition were mainly 5 in number; namely, 1. To capture Malta as a halfway station; 2. To establish a French colony in Africa for the production of sugar and cotton, to compensate for the loss of the West India Islands in the war with England; 3. To cut through the Isthmus of Suez and seize the Red Sea; 4. To make Egypt a base for an advance on India; and 5. To open an eastern outlet to French commerce, and eventually to exclude England from all her possessions in the Orient. In the expedition were many officers who were to attain great distinction under the Empire, such as Murat and Davout, who were then both in command of dragoons; Bessières, Lannes, and Junot. Berthier was chief of staff; Desaix and Kléber were at the head of divisions, and Marmont of a brigade. The cavalry, 4,000 strong, was commanded by a stalwart mulatto, Alexandre Dumas, the father of the great romancer. The most distinguished officer was Desaix, small in stature, but very active, a born commander. The handsomest man in the army was Kléber, an officer of great courage, capable of marvelous deeds. The French fleet comprised 100 battleships, and nearly 400 transports, carrying about 35,000 troops. In this age of steam and the wireless, Napoleon's expedition would have been overtaken and destroyed in less than a week. Even in those days it was only by the most incredible good luck that he and his big fleet safely traversed the Mediterranean, while the greatest of British sailors was scouring the sea in search of him. While Nelson was setting his course for the southern part of Italy on the assumption that the French expedition was headed for Naples or Sicily, Napoleon was steering toward the African shore, passing outside of Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily, and making for Malta, which was reached after a sail of about 3 weeks. This island was held by the Knights of St. John, the last of those companies of Christian soldiers who had once waged war on the infidels in Palestine. After having been driven from Jerusalem to the rock of St. Jean d'Acre, and from there to Rhodes, they had found refuge behind the ramparts of this barren island. The Grand Master at once surrendered without any defense. At Malta there was found an immense supply of weapons and munitions, including 1,200 guns. The order of the Knights of St. John was abolished, and the island reorganized on a French plan. Leaving a garrison of 4,000 men, Bonaparte continued his route toward Egypt. By this time Nelson had begun to suspect that the French were going to Egypt, and had set his course for Alexandria. With his faster vessels he passed the French during the night, and arrived at Alexandria 2 days before the French fleet. Not finding the French there, he again set sail for the Syrian coast. Bonaparte reached Alexandria on the evening of the 30th of June, and commenced the debarkation of his troops the same night. The next day he marched on the city. Alexandria in its earlier days was protected on the sea front by an island, and this in Caesar's time was joined to the mainland by a causeway. On this island was the Pharos, a lighthouse 400 feet high, one of the 7 wonders of the world. This causeway had gradually been widened until the northern part of the city had become a peninsula, the projecting points of which enclosed 2 ports, the new on the east, and the old on the west. The Alexandria of today, with its 400,000 inhabitants, is much changed from the squalid village of 5,000 people which Napoleon found. The only landmark that has survived the changes of the centuries is Pompey's Pillar, which still looms above the roofs and towers of the city. The once famous lighthouse of Pharos has disappeared, and a fort covers the site. From a mound near Pompey's Column, Napoleon directed the assault upon the town. His artillery had not yet been landed, but the first outworks were easily carried by assault, and the city and forts capitulated the same day. Egypt at that time was nominally a part of the Sultan's domains, under a viceroy. Actually it was ruled by the Mamelukes, a warlike caste whose capital city was Cairo. The Mamelukes were commanded by Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey. Murad was a brave officer and controlled military affairs, while Ibrahim, who was rich and wise, looked after the civil administration. In order not to give the Mamelukes time to concert means of defense, Bonaparte decided to push on at once toward Cairo. St. Louis had required 4 months to march from Alexandria to the capital. Napoleon made the same distance in 15 days. Leaving Alexandria on the 6th of July, Napoleon marched with his army parallel to the Nile, keeping pace with the flotilla which carried his supplies. Before reaching the capital it was necessary to fight. On the 13th of July the French encountered Murad, who was posted with 4,000 horsemen near the village of Chebris, with his right flank resting on the river, where it was covered by a flotilla. The combat began between the two flotillas. Bonaparte immediately attacked, adopting the order of battle used by the Russians against the Turks, each division being formed in squares enclosing the equipages and the few cavalry which he possessed. In vain the Mamelukes threw themselves against the solid squares of the French. At last, harassed by the fire of the French artillery, they fell back toward the capital. The French army then continued its way up the banks of the Nile to Embabeh, opposite Cairo. There the Mamelukes had their fortified camp, and there that superb cavalry was waiting to overwhelm the invaders. On the 21st of July the French arrived in sight of the capital, and the same day was fought the Battle of the Pyramids. No more dramatic engagement had been fought since the days of the Crusaders. Beside the two armies rolled the mysterious Nile. Beyond glittered the slender minarets of Cairo, and on the south there loomed the massive Pyramids. Napoleon raised the enthusiasm of his soldiers to the highest pitch by his address. "Soldiers, you have come to rescue Egypt from barbarism, to bring civilization into the East, and to save this beautiful land from the yoke of England. 40 centuries are looking down on you from the tops of these monuments." The Mamelukes attacked in great numbers, but all their brilliant charges failed against the intrepidity of the French squares. Never were charges better made or better sustained. Finally the Mamelukes fled in disorder, leaving a large part of their forces dead on the field of battle. Murad retired with the wreck of his command to Upper Egypt. From Cairo, Ibrahim, who had not taken part in the battle, fled to the east toward the Syrian desert. About 2,000 Mamelukes were slain, while only 50 French were killed, and about 200 wounded. Many fine horses were captured and piles of beautiful weapons, and large sums of gold were taken by the French, as the Mamelukes were in the habit of carrying their valuables on their persons. Napoleon's first headquarters were installed at Giza, where the palace of Murad furnished him a luxurious residence. He was compelled to await the arrival of his flotilla in order to cross to Cairo, which was then a city of 200,000 souls. On the 22nd the French occupied the town and citadel, and 2 days later Napoleon moved his headquarters there. Desaix was sent to Upper Egypt in pursuit of Murad, while Bonaparte himself left Cairo on the 7th of August in pursuit of Ibrahim, who was driven into the Syrian desert and took refuge at Gaza. Bonaparte then returned to Cairo, where he learned of the destruction of his fleet by Nelson. On the 3rd of July, before leaving Alexandria, Napoleon had given orders to his admiral to report to him at once whether it was possible for the fleet to enter the port of Alexandria, and if not, whether he could defend himself in Aboukir roads against the superior forces of the enemy. In case neither of these plans was practicable, he was directed to set sail immediately for Corfu and Toulon. The admiral thought his position was impregnable, and remained in the harbor of Aboukir. Here he was attacked by Nelson on the evening of the 1st of August. The battle lasted 36 hours, and ended in the destruction of nearly all of the French fleet. Bruez by a glorious death expiated his fault which proved so fatal to the French. This disaster was a severe blow to Bonaparte; but in order to restore the morale of his army, he affected a confidence which he could no longer feel. Even some of his highest officers complained of their miserable position. The versatility of Napoleon's genius was never more marked than at this time of discouragement, and with his savants he developed constructive powers of the highest order which made the army independent of Europe. The food supply was increased by extending the cultivation of corn and rice. Windmills were constructed for grinding corn, as well as large ovens and bakeries. Foundries and workshops soon began to supply tools and machinery, even gunpowder was manufactured. Much also was done to extend the bounds of learning. Astronomy gained much by the observations of Caffarelli. An exact survey of Egypt was begun. The engineers and geologists examined the course of the Nile, and made records of the alluvial deposits at its mouth and on its banks. The motherland of science and learning, after a well nigh barren interval of 1100 years since the Arab conquest, says Rose, was now developed and illumined by the application of the arts with which in the dim past she had enriched the life of barbarous Europe. The repayment of this incalculable debt was due primarily to the enterprise of Bonaparte. It is one of his many titles to fame and to the homage of posterity. How poor by the side of this encyclopedic genius are the gifts even of his most brilliant foes! At that same time the Archduke Charles of Austria was vegetating in glorious ease on his estates. Nelson, after his recent triumph, was bending before the whims of a professional beauty. While the Admiral tarnished his fame on the siren coast of Naples, his great opponent bent all the resources of a fertile intellect to retrieve his position, and even under the gloom of disaster, threw a gleam of light into the dark continent. Meanwhile, Turkey, encouraged by the destruction of the French fleet, had declared war on France, and was sending an army through Syria for the recovery of Egypt, while another expedition was assembling at Rhodes. Bonaparte, as usual, decided to take the initiative, and to attack and destroy the Syrian force before the cessation of the winter's gales would allow the other Turkish expedition to attempt a landing at Aboukir. The fertile delta of the Nile is separated from Syria by the desert of El Jafar. Across this desert run several caravan routes, the most northerly of which crosses parallel to the coast from a point located on the present Suez Canal via El Arish to Gaza. It is an old traveled route about 150 miles long, with a fair supply of wells at convenient distances. The sea being closed to the French by the disaster of Aboukir, the only way of reaching Syria was to follow the path for centuries covered by the caravans. The 1st of January, 1799, there were about 30,000 French troops in Egypt, of whom nearly 13,000 were detailed for the Syrian expedition. Desaix with 10,000 troops was left in Upper Egypt, while Marmont, with about 7,000 men, was in Lower Egypt. The divisions of Kléber, Bon, Lannes, and Régnier, each of about 2,500 men, formed the Syrian army, together with the cavalry of Murat, about 800 strong, and some 2,000 guides, camel riders, sappers, and artillerymen. A good siege equipment was to go to Jaffa by sea. Engineers had cleared out the wells on the road; camels with water went ahead of the columns; and the divisions were ordered to march at a day's distance apart, to avoid overtaxing the limited water supply. Bonaparte left Cairo on the 10th of February. Régnier, who commanded the advance column, had reached El Arish the previous day, and found the place held by 2,000 men. He immediately attacked and drove the garrison into the fort with a loss of about 500 men. 2 days later Kléber came up, and on the 16th Bonaparte himself arrived. After considerable correspondence, the fort finally surrendered on the 19th. The army then proceeded to Gaza, which was reached after a very fatiguing march of 48 hours. All the army united near this city, which had been evacuated by the enemy, leaving the French in possession of its great magazines. Gaza, which today is an important place of 40,000 inhabitants, was then only a small town. It will be remembered in biblical history as the place whose gates were carried off by Samson on his stalwart shoulders, and where he pulled down the pillars of the house and slew 3,000 Philistines. Alexander had to besiege the town for 2 months before he could enter the gates, but Napoleon took it without firing a shot. On the 3rd of March the army reached Jaffa, which was carried by assault 3 days later. Contrary to the orders of Bonaparte, some 2,000 prisoners were taken, and the question at once arose as to what was to be done with these men. If they were kept, they would consume rations, and the army was already short of food. If, on the other hand, they were released, they would probably rejoin the Turks. As a matter of fact, a part of them had already been discharged at El Arish on their promise not to serve against the French, and they were now taken in arms. It was a difficult problem, and it was solved in the least merciful way. The Turks were taken out and shot down. This incident has been one of the most severely criticized in Bonaparte's career, yet it is justified by most modern military writers on the ground that a general cannot afford to sacrifice the vital interests of his army to those of humanity. The main Turkish force under Ahmed Bey, known as Djezzar the Butcher, was at St. Jean d'Acre. Djezzar had taken every means for the defense of the place, which was invested on the 18th of March. The fortifications consisted of a wall flanked by towers and surrounded by a ditch. The French means of attack were not even sufficient to overcome these slight obstacles, for Sidney Smith, commanding the English cruisers, had captured the French siege train which had been sent from Alexandria by sea, and had mounted the guns on the walls. Associated with Djezzar in defense of Acre were two men who had crossed the path of Napoleon in other years and in other lands. One of them was a young English sailor of fortune, who, after serving with the Swedish and Turkish fleets, had joined the British navy, and was at Toulon when it fell under the fire of Napoleon's batteries. This was Sidney Smith. The other ally of Djezzar was a Frenchman, a graduate of the École Militaire in Paris, and a classmate of Napoleon. At the school they had quarreled constantly. This was Philippot, an aristocrat by birth, and an enemy of the Republic. St. Jean d'Acre was a place of considerable importance, which had figured largely in the Crusades, being taken and retaken several times during the 12th century. After this it was held for 100 years by the Knights of St. John, and was the last Christian stronghold in Palestine. It stands on a peninsula with an exposed and useless harbor, but Haifa at the south of it has a large and fairly well protected roadstead. The place has sometimes been called the Key of Palestine. In 1799 the works had fallen somewhat into decay, although Djezzar had done much to repair the defenses on the land side. The French trenches were opened on the 20th of March, and the first assault was made 8 days later. Napoleon now received intelligence of the approach of a Turkish army from Damascus and Palestine. To meet this hostile force, Kléber was dispatched toward the Jordan with his division, and also Murat with his detachment of cavalry. A few days later, learning that the enemy had passed the Jordan, and that Kléber was about to be attacked, Napoleon flew to his assistance. Leaving the camp before Acre on the 15th of April, the next morning he arrived in sight of the enemy near Mount Tabor. The Turkish forces, about 20,000 strong, entirely surrounded the division of Kléber, who was maintaining his position with great bravery. On the arrival of Bonaparte with reinforcements, the enemy, already discouraged by the stout resistance of Kléber's squares, fled in disorder. This singular victory had such an effect upon the Turks that they did not venture to trouble the French again during the siege. Mount Tabor is the most historic of all of Napoleon's extraordinary battlefields. It is a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. The night after the battle, Napoleon slept in the monastery of Annunciation, where the fathers have treasured since the bedroom where the young warrior rested. In the meantime the siege was pushed with obstinacy, but with little success. The Turks defended themselves with great valor. 5 assaults had already been made, when a flotilla appeared, which had been fitted out at Rhodes to reprovision the port. Seeking to anticipate this succor, Napoleon ordered another assault to be made on the 8th of May, which was also repulsed. He was therefore obliged to prepare to retreat, but was unwilling to retire without making one more attempt. On the morning and the evening of the 10th of May the attack was renewed for the 7th and 8th times. Led with reckless gallantry by the heroic Lannes, the troops gained part of the wall and planted the tricolor on the northeast tower. But all further progress was checked by the English marines who had poured into the town, and the Turkish reinforcements, which were landed in time to save the day. Lannes himself was dangerously wounded in the neck, and was saved only by the devotion of a fellow officer. For the remainder of his life he was obliged to carry his head on one side. On the 22nd of May the siege was raised, and the troops were started on their return to Egypt. It was a great disappointment to Napoleon. At the height of his European triumphs he was heard to say, "J'ai manqué à ma fortune à St. Jean d'Acre." There were 2 very serious reasons for his retreat, aside from the repulse before the walls of the town. He had just heard of the formation of the second coalition against France, and also of revolts in Egypt, which demanded his attention. Napoleon's 400-mile retreat from Acre down the Syrian coast, across the plains of Palestine and the desert of Elche, was an anticipation in miniature of the terrible retreat from Moscow through the snows of a Russian winter. On his return march, Napoleon ordered all the horses to be given over to the sick and wounded, and set the example by himself marching on foot. On his arrival at Jaffa, many of the garrison left there in the advance on Acre were found in the hospital, some with the plague. All but a very few of the sick were taken away when the French left the place, and the rest were found living by Sidney Smith on his arrival 3 days after the French army had departed. There is therefore not the slightest truth in the statement frequently made that Napoleon ordered the doctors to poison the soldiers whom he was not able to take with him. After a painful march, Napoleon reached Cairo with the main body of his troops on the 14th of June. Towards the end of July, the Mamelukes, under the command of Murad, descended towards Giza, and again appeared in Lower Egypt. While making preparations to attack them, Napoleon heard that 15,000 Turks had just landed from the fleet of Rhodes at Aboukir, and had carried by assault the fort at that place. He immediately marched on Alexandria, and on the 25th of July attacked the Turks at Aboukir, and defeated them with great slaughter. Many of the enemy endeavored to regain the vessels, and all who were not killed in the battle perished in the waves, except about 2,000 men, who made their escape into the fort, and were later taken prisoners. While making some arrangements with Sidney Smith under a flag of truce after the battle, Napoleon sent him a chest of coffee and a case of brandy. In return for these gifts, Smith sent him a batch of European newspapers only 6 weeks old. From these Napoleon learned of the reverses of the French armies in Italy and on the Rhine, and of the disorganized and disgraceful state of affairs under the Directory at Paris. Under these circumstances he decided that it was his duty to return to France. He had no motive for prolonging his stay in Egypt. The country was completely conquered, and the only task left was to guard it. Kléber, who was left in command, was as capable as any one of carrying out Napoleon's plans. Napoleon therefore set sail for France on the 24th of August with 4 small vessels. He was accompanied by Lannes and Murat, both recently wounded, as well as by Berthier, Duroc, Marmont, Bessières, and Lavalette. He also took with him his secretary, Bourrienne, and Eugène de Beauharnais. Sir Sidney Smith having gone to Cyprus for repairs, Napoleon slipped out unmolested. A northwest wind obliged the vessels to run close to the African coast, and they took 20 days to make 300 miles. By great good fortune the frigates eluded the English ships cruising between Malta and Cape Bon. Finally an east wind came up and Sardinia was reached, and then Corsica. In the port of Ajaccio, Napoleon was detained for 9 days by adverse winds. There full news was received of the French reverses in Italy. Finally, on the 7th of October, the wind having become favorable, he sailed for France. The following evening, when the mountains of Provence were in full sight, by the rays of the setting sun, a fleet of English vessels was seen on the horizon. All on board thought they would certainly be captured. Bonaparte alone kept his usual calm. He pointed out to the officers of the ship that the setting sun which lighted up the sails of the English vessels on the horizon would leave in the shadow the sails of his frigates. "Nous voyons," he said, "et nous ne sommes pas vus. Courage donc." On the morning of the 9th of October, at 8 o'clock, they entered the Bay of St. Raphael, a short distance from Fréjus. The voyage had lasted 46 days. As soon as it was known that Bonaparte had returned, the shore was covered with a multitude of people. Napoleon had feared that he might be detained by quarantine regulations, but the crowd cried, "No quarantine for you! The plague rather than the Austrians!" A horse was brought to him which he mounted, and amidst the acclamations of the crowds he entered Fréjus, where he remained only a few hours. His route to Paris was one long triumph. At Aix, at Avignon, at Valence, he was received with indescribable transports of enthusiasm. Arrived at Lyons, he remained a day, and in the evening went to the theatre, where he was obliged to conceal himself in the back of his loge. At midnight he again set out, but instead of taking the usual route towards Mâcon, he went by way of the Bourbonnais, traveling in a voiture de poste at great speed, not stopping by night or day. Paris had been notified by telegraph of the return of the hero, and the evening of the 10th of October, while dining at the Luxembourg with Geer, the President of the Directory, Josephine was informed of the landing of her husband. That same night she left Paris to meet Napoleon en route, but as she took the usual road through Bourgogne, while he was following the route of the Bourbonnais, she was not successful in meeting him, and he reached Paris before she could return. Napoleon arrived in Paris on the morning of the 16th of October. He went directly to his house in the Rue de la Victoire, where, as upon his return from Italy, he found no one to receive him. His brothers, in the absence of Josephine, took every means to arouse his wrath and jealousy, and he began to talk at once of a separation or a divorce. Upon Josephine's return he refused to see her, and remained locked up in his room. Finally, at the suggestion of a friend, she sent for her children, Eugène and Hortense, who, on their arrival, joined their supplications to those of their mother. Napoleon finally decided to open the door, and when his brothers arrived the following morning, they found that all had been forgotten and forgiven. Notwithstanding all of Josephine's faults, real or imaginary, Napoleon was very wise in effecting a reconciliation with his wife. Separation at that time would have caused a scandal which might have interfered seriously with his plans. He did well to cut short the accusations of his brothers, and to employ his activities in more serious matters than family troubles. With her perfect tact and consummate knowledge of the society of Paris and the political world, Josephine proved very useful in his plans. If the expedition to Egypt was not beneficial to France, it was to Napoleon. He always had the talent of placing his successes in the limelight, while he left his reverses in the shadow. Egypt was far away, and the French heard only of the brilliant victories of Bonaparte. The expedition was not a success, and yet for him it served as a footstool to the throne. End of Chapter 7.